The construction of miniature stages began years ago when I was preparing a master's thesis on the theatrical arts of France. It was during the Christmas holidays. One evening my fancy was caught by the picture of an ancient French theater. Gathering up some Christmas cards and bits of tinsel, I built a model of the Valenciennes stage constructed for a mystery play of 1547. The study of mise-en-scène, stage setting, and decor interested me more and more. I decided to build sturdier sets, and my apartment was quickly turned into a workshop and madhouse. The bedroom was stacked with material. An electric jigsaw and other tools decorated the kitchen table, but most of the work was done on a mahogany dining room table. One day 5 holes were accidentally bored in this table with a drill press. The odor of paint and glue filled the entire house. The models were first used for instructional purposes and were constructed merely to show concretely the beginnings and further development of theaters, settings, and decor of the European and American scene. Eventually, one model went on display at the New York World's Fair of 1939, where it won a blue ribbon. Theater was revived in the 10th century in the form of religious plays. They were inaugurated by the European priests as a means of instruction to the untutored public. The plays were realistically presented with the idea of teaching the joys of heaven and the horrors of hell. Medieval man gazed at the long scenes in heaven in pious devotion, but awaited eagerly the fiery tortures of hell and the comic performances of the little devils who served Lucifer. Even at this early date, theater reflected the life and spirit of the times. The play started with the scene of the 3 Marys at the tomb of Christ, set up in front of the high altar of a cathedral. Later, to comply with realism, a background of rolling landscape was sometimes depicted. It is interesting to note that a curtain was used to hide the tomb, and was lifted by one of the Marys to look into the Holy Sepulchre. Yet it will be centuries later that a curtain appears to hide a whole stage and change of scene. All the early plays were performed inside the cathedral by clerics and preceded by elaborate processions. It is amazing to consider the background beauty of this early theater. The lofty arches of the Gothic cathedral, the rays of the sun glowing through the beautiful stained glass windows, candles in red cups lighting dark corners, actors dressed in velvet and lace regardless of the roles they were playing. And don't forget the music of the organ, the choir, and the chimes of the bell tower, a prelude to opera. Here is the layout for an early German mystery which illustrates clearly the medieval setting. The plays grew longer and longer, and the mystery, referring to the dramatization of any religious function, became the most popular type. Crowds flocked to the plays, and by the late Middle Ages, the productions moved out of doors entirely and were abandoned by the clergy. In France, the public square became the usual site for the temporary theaters. In England, a street intersection or the courtyard of an inn was utilized. God, Jesus, angels, and the Virgin Mary were often brought down from above to perform some miraculous deed before the worshipful audience. For in St. Matthew, Jesus had said, "And they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." The medieval mystery stage is referred to as the multiple, dispersed, or simultaneous setting, for all the scenes for a day's play, or even longer, were in view simultaneously. Each set was called a house, domus from the Latin, mansion, Old French from maison, and casa from the Spanish. The plays were presented in the daytime for 5 days or more. The spectators stood throughout the productions, moving from one set to another. This stage shows a French mystery of the 15th century having to do with the torture and rape of little Saint Apollonia. It is believed that this theater had some influence on the later Shakespearean stage, although the latter was also influenced by the arrangement of balconies around the courtyard of an inn. At the left is the representation of heaven. At right, the traditional hell mouth. In England, the so-called chariot or pageant wagon appeared as one of a series of mobile settings, moving from one section of the city to another, followed by others with different settings on other days. It is somewhat similar to our modern float. On the upper level, this model shows the scene of the Annunciation, with curtained dressing rooms for the actors on the lower level. The Passion Play presented at Valenciennes in 1547 was probably the most elaborately staged mystery of the Middle Ages, and sadly enough, it marks not only the triumph of the genre, but also the beginning of the end. Again, we have the perfect simultaneous setting with 11 or 12 mentions: the palace, the temple, with the nativity scene in progress in front of the portal to Bethlehem. Paradise was usually represented in two ways: the terrestrial paradise, or Garden of Eden, and the celestial paradise, home of God the Father and his angels. At the right, we have a fabulous concoction of hell. The gaping dragon's mouth was the entrance to this inferno. The Bible had said that hell was in the bowels of the earth, so below the hell tower there was a cave from which a great clatter came, produced by beating on kettles, rolling barrels loaded with stones. Smoke and flames gushed from the mouth of the dreadful beast. At the command of Lucifer, out would run the little devils to seize the wicked and drag them into this chamber of horrors. Note the mangled forms on the wheels of torture. Here medieval man got his real thrills. In nearby limbo are the poor old philosophers Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. They couldn't go to heaven because they were not Christians, but they didn't have to go to hell because they were good guys. They did nevertheless have a fine seat for the show. There is some fascinating material in the plans and account book of the director of a big mystery at Mons, France, in 1501. Careful descriptions and exact prices for hiring of actors and stagehands, for materials, meals, everything is there. He tells how to construct the hell mouth, earthquakes, floods, walking ghost scenes. He must have been a careful bookkeeper, but he was a worrier at heart. He notes, "Warn Barakan to take a trumpet with him to trumpet with when he is notified. Check to see that the altar is removed from the top of the mountain during the dinner hour." I am also afraid his profits were not great. He served mutton and wine to all the actors and stagehands after the show and at his own expense. Even so, some of these gentlemen wandered off to the cafes to spend more of his money, for he adds, "To the devil and his company for supper at Le Clay, 40 sous. To God the Father and others up to 22 persons for supper at the Griffon, 50 sous. To St. Peter and other apostles, 20 sous. Now the devils not only sought out and bedeviled the damned, as the Furies had done in the Greek underworld, but very early they began to present little comic sketches known as farces. The word farce is from the French farcir, to stuff. The comic scenes were literally stuffed in between the long, serious acts of the religious play to relieve the tedium. This without any great knowledge of the Greek theater, where bawdy comedies served a somewhat similar purpose. They became popular and have remained so. However, as part of the religious plays, they also became crude and even obscene. The church was displeased with this turn of events, as it was with some of the bedroom scenes. Finally, in the middle of the 16th century, the government, urged on by the church, banned the performance of religious plays in France. The form died out quite rapidly over Europe, so that we of today are left with only a few survivals of importance. Mainly the Passion Play of Oberammergau, Germany. These scenes are from the 1960 production. In 1633, when the Black Plague was decimating the Bavarian countryside, the citizens of Oberammergau made a vow that if their village should be spared, they would present the story of the Passion every year during Holy Week. This vow they have kept, but as the plays became more complex, they were presented every 10 years. Today, the performances have acquired the use of modern theatrical techniques, but still maintain the rich pageantry and liturgical quality of the Middle Ages. What is interesting is that they also show noticeable classical conceptions in the structure of the stage itself, and in the use of a chorus appearing in Greek or Roman garb. These ideas were brought in from Italy by Jesuit priests. We can almost hear the shouts of the crowd. Crucify him. In the 15th century, a bright, colorful culture burst into bloom in Italy, drawing the scenic designers of Germany, France, and England to Italy to feast their eyes on the new Renaissance theaters and mise-en-scène. What they saw dazzled them and forced them to acknowledge that their long, tedious religious plays, with huge, cluttered stages, were completely out of date. Though the farce remained, classical tragedy and comedy soon replaced the mystery, miracle, and morality plays. Stages were moved indoors and, for the most part, elegantly simplified in decor. From the 16th century on, we shall have to divide our study of theater arts into two branches, the court theater and the public theater, which began a slow development in the late 16th and 17th centuries. There were three especially important Renaissance stages in the 16th century: the Olimpico, the Andrea, and Inigo Jones. The Teatro Olimpico, constructed at Vicenza, was the greatest sensation of its day. The Italian designers had studied the outdoor amphitheaters of the ancients. The Greek theater had its inception in the competitions of poets, house, used as dressing rooms for the actors. The plays were really solemn religious rites. The façade of the Sceni had three main portals. In front of the acting ledge was a dancing area for the chorus. The chorus was useful to Greek tragedy. It served to set the tragic atmosphere, gave information to help maintain the rules of the three unities, or the rule prohibiting violence on the stage. Although in ruins, many of these theaters exist in Greece today. Other devices were in use also, and one of the most interesting was the periaktoi. These were mobile, sometimes revolving platforms set just behind a portal of the façade. Here a murder, suicide, or battle could be depicted without breaking the rules. The Greeks also made use of a cloud machine erected over the stage. It was a platform hidden by representations of clouds and was brought down to permit Zeus, Apollo, or a goddess to descend to earth to straighten out the entangled affairs of man. From this device we get the term Deus ex machina, God out of machine, a term which is still in use in theatrical parlance to refer to the artificial and unreasonable conclusion to a play. Later, the Romans made only a few changes in the stages for classical drama. They added two portals to the façade and reduced the size of the dancing area, making it a semicircle and bringing it closer to the acting ledge. The Teatro Olimpico was constructed on the above classical conceptions, with 5 portals opening onto the acting ledge. An interest in perspective had arisen during the Renaissance, and Palladio had constructed perspective scenes behind each portal of the façade. This was indeed an innovation. It is to be noted that these streets and buildings in perspective formed a solid architectural feature, and thus were not utilized for the entrance of the actors, as the latter would have appeared grotesque, towering over the buildings in the rear and walking down the slanting streets to the stage. Perspective and painted scenery now became important features of mise-en-scène. For public performances, the Italians introduced the Commedia dell'arte, where the cleverest comedians of all time offered improvised sketches. These amusing and often bawdy comedies were presented on primitive stages in towns or at country crossroads, and they will have a tremendous influence on the French comedy of the 17th century. In a theater built shortly after the Olimpico at Parma, the Italians widened the main portal of the façade and moved it closer to the edge of the stage. The sides of the portal thus became a frame for a picture. Witness the birth of the proscenium arch and the apron to the stage. Next, they began night performances which introduced lighting effects, at which they were extremely clever. Glass bowls of varied sizes and shapes were filled with colored water. Torches and candles sent a glow across the stage. Even on elegant stages, it was a long time before they thought of dropping a curtain for change of scene, although some curtains were in evidence. But they did have change of scene. Sometimes an acrobat would perform on the apron, or a juggler would whirl huge glass circles dizzily in the air, while behind him stagehands scrambled to move flats and decor. Some directors even went so far as to arrange for a fight to take place in the back of the auditorium so the spectators would turn around to see what was going on and thus miss the activities on stage for change of scene. One famous French Renaissance stage set in the sumptuous ballroom was an exact imitation of one built in Italy in 1493 for the Andrea of Terence, showing a different version of the Roman facade. It has 4 portals, and above each we read the name of the actor who will use the portal for his entrance onto the stage from the scene, a matter of identification for the spectators. The name plate at the right, unlike the others, reads Do Simonis, Domus, home of Simon. The area behind the curtains was not utilized as part of the acting area. In England, an elaborate stage was built by Inigo Jones, who was scenic designer for the court of James I and later for Charles. He had become fascinated with the Italian ideas. He introduced to the British court all the wonders he had seen: a proscenium arch, which is a veritable picture frame, a dancing area, and most exciting of all, 4 revolving perioctoi, whereby 3 different sets representing the sea, a pastoral scene, and the ballet, all in perspective, could be shown by a twist of the wrist below stage. The trouble was that poor old Ben Jonson was the one who had to twist the wrist. Jonson and Inigo Jones had been having a bitter feud for years over the relative value of poetry and mise-en-scène, for Jonson was the court poet who wrote the plays. Here, in 1631, Inigo is jubilant, for who do you think is below, turning the cumbersome perioctoi? Ben Jonson in person, in a rage. Inigo also provided a deus ex machina idea, a cloud machine for a goddess, the head ballerina. Proceeding into the 17th century, France became the intellectual and cultural center of Western civilization and produced her own truly golden age. Although the court theater continued with ever greater brilliance, the public theater made slow progress. Of course, there were always the strolling players, and in these groups Molière got his start in theatrical affairs. The players had little money but often great talent. They performed wherever they could, at the crossroads near a town, on a bridge like the Pont Neuf, but in France they used, whenever possible, an indoor tennis court. This was a long rectangular building, usually with walls and a roof, but with a great gap between walls and roof. No heat was available. In bad weather, wind, rain, and snow poured in on the long-suffering actors as well as upon the spectators. But the latter streamed to the performances of Molière during his 12 years of trouping the provinces. We turn now for a glance at the public theater in Paris in the early part of the century. This is a period of transition. 2 men are mainly responsible for the development of the French public theater at this time: Alexandre Hardy, who wrote and produced the plays, and his scenic designer, Malo. Both worked hard to attract and please the public, but this was not a learned public. It was the common man, a man who was not fascinated with the new classical drama, its rules and intellectual approach. He wanted action, excitement, wild and even bloody scenes. Hardy and Malo delivered the goods at the Hôtel de Bourgogne in Paris, a theater constructed like an indoor tennis court. In the hotel, a few seats were provided in the balconies, but most spectators stood. The production La Folie de Clédemont shows a typical Malo stage for the Hôtel de Bourgogne. Normally, he used a reduced simultaneous setting with 3, 5, or 7 mentions. The center usually depicted a palace and shows the Renaissance influence. The sets to the left reveal the lingering medieval trend. At the right, we see the entrance to a royal bedroom. Few furnishings were used, but the idea of following the unity of place was completely scorned at the hotel. Giseran said of Hardy's designer, "Malo's devisings are quite like those which Sidney had derided in London years ago, with Asia of the one side and Africa of the other." After the time of Hardy and Malo, the cultured people began to take a greater interest in the public theater. They preferred a play and stage constructed according to the rules of classicism, that is, an elegant, permanent architectural background for tragedy, a lavish spectacle stage for ballet. The great tragedies of the 17th century French theater were performed on stages like this. When Pierre Corneille presented his Cid in 1636, there was such a tremendous crowd that the elite were allowed to sit on the stage. From this time on, the spectator on the stage became a custom in Paris, and the young fops of society were a great annoyance to the actors. For Corneille, it was a struggle to maintain the rules of the ancients. When he introduced a new setting in the second act of the Cid, he added rather pathetically, "Without doubt there is some excess in this license I have taken." Nevertheless, it is certain that he paved the way for the simple, distinguished theater of Jean Racine, master of French tragedy and a real innovator of symbolic design. The common man had no interest in this type of culture. He went off to the carnivals and fairs where life was gay and unrestrained. Here he could see clowns, puppets, acrobats, and brief comic skits of all kinds. The interest in culture had really appeared under His Eminence the Cardinal Richelieu in the time of Louis XIII, but Louis XIV continued the effort and sent France soaring into greatness. Although Louis had many weaknesses, we must give him credit for the status of culture during his reign, and he loved the theater arts above all, partly perhaps because they lent the proper background to his elegant royal person. He had many fabulous palaces. The Versailles Palace alone cost several $100 million at today's money value. His court theater had to match this luxury, for he often took part in the performances and was considered the finest ballet dancer of his time. He moved from palace to palace with his court in tow. One show presented for one night often cost millions of dollars, and his own bejeweled costume from $1 to $2 million. After all, he was the Sun King, the inventor of the savoir-vivre conception of the French. Molière was the one who prepared the ballroom performances as well as those for the royal theaters at the Petit Bourbon and later the Palais Royal. He was a glorified and talented troubadour, for he not only wrote and produced the plays, but performed the main roles as well. This last theater of the French Golden Age is a spectacle ballroom production for Louis XIV. Everything went to excess at the court, and so it had happened with perspective cloud scenery, which covers the entire stage. A ballet is in progress, and the spectator is on the stage. People are eating, drinking, and chatting during the performance. From the magnificent heavens, a ballerina descends to the stage floor. In a box at the right, Louis XIV is sitting with a new mistress in whose honor the show is being performed. Madame the Queen is at the left of the stage with some of her ladies-in-waiting. This was a charming little social habit of the king. Once in 1662 he had danced the ballet with his young queen. That was their last dance together before the court. Yes, here in the midst of a refined but artificial society, the gilded stage is set for this Caesar, the Prince of Light. And 100 years later, the glory will crumble, and the die will be cast for Louis XVI and French royalty. We move ahead now to several American theaters. Nature herself has graciously endowed the state of Colorado with an outdoor stage, set upon a mountain slope where it glows in Hellenic beauty. There is no need for artificial techniques to provide perfect acoustic reception in the Red Rock Theater of Denver. Here is a space architectural or sculptural stage for a production of Hamlet, completely different from the traditional Shakespearean stage, and it is classical in its simplicity and form. The lofty panels, steps, and varying floor levels are all painted dark blue. There are no furnishings, no decor. But, as in Shakespeare's theater, costume stands out against a smooth, plain background. Yet, we certainly have here a modern simultaneous setting, for the stage is set for all the scenes of the great tragedy. A shaft of light moving from one level to another serves as curtain for change of scene.
Alas, poor ghost, speak, I am bound to hear. I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub.
O gentle sun, upon the heat and flame of thy distemper sprinkle cool patience. Whereon do you look?
On him, on him. Look you how pale he glares. Do not look upon me.
To whom speak you this?
Do you see nothing there?
Nothing at all. The last theater shows a modern spectacle stage as I knew it some years ago, Radio City Music Hall in Rockefeller Center. Today we have many types of the performing arts, and we follow no rules. Electrification has brought endless possibilities in lighting and mechanical effects, but it has been hard to outdo the scenic ideas and skills of the ancients or of the Italian Renaissance designers. Music hall productions contain elements of both popular and classical art. The performers are divided into several permanent groups: the symphony orchestra, the corps de ballet, the men's glee club, and the famous Rockettes, performing in a wide row of 36 precision dancers. As the show begins, we see a great golden proscenium arch in the form of a sunburst. We hear the music of the tremendous pipe organ, and at the left a mobile platform bearing organ and organist moves into view. Later it glides back out of sight. A flow of deep green light is thrown across the shimmering folds of the golden contour curtain. Then come the soft strains of string and harp, and from the pit in front of the stage there rises slowly before us the bandwagon, bearing the 75-member symphony orchestra. All remains in the deep emerald glow except the golden instruments of the musicians. As the number ends, the bandwagon disappears silently below stage. The lights go up, the contour curtain changes form to reveal the vast acting area. The show is on, dancers in lovely costumes whirling on a true spectacle stage. What a thrill it would have been for Louis XIV. During some performances, visible change of scene becomes part of an act, and is one of the great pleasures of the spectator. Stage lights and footlights are dimmed. Flats and decor move silently, up, down, left, right. And at the same time, the whole center of the stage, like a glorified version of one of the Greek perioptoi, turns mysteriously to reveal an entirely new and beautiful scene. That, my friends, is show business in the 20th century USA.